This is David Prager Branner. I'm recording this talk. It's for the plenary session at the American Oriental Society meeting 17 March 2021. The topic is philology, and I am the plenary speaker for East Asia. These are my contents, and let me talk first about how I define philology. This is part one. Let me compare the professional character of the philologist to that of the software engineer, as described by Edgar Dijkstra in 1988. He says it involves handling multiple orders of magnitude in the same work, combining fine detail with a high-level view of whatever the task is. From a bit to a few hundred megabytes, from a microsecond to a half an hour of computing, confronts us with a completely baffling ratio of 109. By this ratio of 109, he means a logarithmic measure of the difference in order of magnitude between one bit of data and a few hundred megabytes. Remember that he's writing about a third of a century ago. Or 1 microsecond of time to half an hour of it. He says that this simultaneous range of different scopes within a single topic of study is larger in computer programming than ever before. He calls this range a deep conceptual hierarchy and says it is a radically new intellectual challenge that has no precedent in our history. He may be right about the newness of this specific range of scopes in human history, but philology is concerned with the high-level import of texts as well as the phrases and words in texts, down even to their constituent sounds and semantic structure and graphic form. There's also a range of scopes here, and the distance from high-level import down to constituent sounds and graphic form seems to me quite large. Before computer programming evolved, philology and its applications to higher-order scopes of an inquiry may have been a case of what Dijkstra calls a gigantic ratio being bridged by a single technology. Another difference is that the philologist is less like a programmer than a forensic engineer. A programmer creates the bottom-level content in the hierarchy to produce those higher levels, while a forensic engineer analyzes the lower levels in order to understand the higher. Still, I think the key likeness is having to pay attention at once to a great range of scopes. Anyone can talk about ideas, but doing so in reference to fine details of a text, and the words and elements of words that make up a text are what defines philology. I return to this subject later in the talk. Part 2. The topic philology at this plenary. Traditionally, the AOS plenary talks have had only a single word theme. When I was invited to give this talk, I was told that the theme was philology, but that the board of directors' hope was that I would talk about the future of philology, although that's more words than are allowed. I was puzzled at first. Why me? I suppose one reason is that after leaving academia in my late 40s, I entered the tech industry and even did formal undergraduate coursework in computer science, which is something I recommend if you can make the time. It's a genuinely beautiful subject. Maybe the board's idea was that I would talk about technology in connection with the future of philology. If so, no dice. There are plenty of interesting programming and data management projects I could single out, but the changes that have come about for philology because of the internet and access to databases and full-text digital corpora are, I would guess, not much different for Chinese than for any other ancient written language. So I don't intend to give them your time now. The other reason the AOS Board of Directors may have chosen me is because I abandoned employment in academia, though not academic research or publication. And what is more, I did so after tenure. That does turn out to be connected to what I have to say today. I bailed out because I realized I was in a rigged card game and struggling to maintain both the program I was running and my own research would fail to secure either. Part 3. Why is philology's future in question? My conclusion when I left academia was that we philologists have lost the struggle with academic administrators and state legislatures, and it's time to accept that and move ahead as we can. I'm not going to defend this claim. You all know what I'm talking about. This has been going on for decades, and the reasons were always economic as well as connected to academic politics and issues of culture and society. I'm sure there are people who disagree or whose programs remain well-funded. But if so, I'll just say that I think overall the view that we're doing all right is misguided, which is probably the same thing those people think of me, only they're wrong. My own teacher, Jerry Norman, was president of the AOS in 2002-2003. 7 or 8 years after that, he pronounced, "I don't know how things like philology will be pursued in the future. I think there will always be people who will want to pursue the sorts of things we do. I think we were lucky to live at a period when such studies were still possible. Perhaps in future such interests can only be pursued as a sort of hobby." I think he was right. And the rest of my talk is about managing this approach to preserving the practice of philology in Chinese. So that's the problem. Chinese philology is losing its home in most American academic institutions. Given that problem, what's the future I would like to see? What's the solution to the problem? How are we going to keep the tradition of Chinese philology alive? Actually, I will answer that question twice. Once in the section below, and then in a different way in the very last line of this presentation. Part 4. My answer to the question of philology's future. The solution I advocate is for us to stay connected with texts, and that means reading them. And I suggest reading them aloud, and I suggest doing it with other people, performing them, that is. Cynical listeners will note that this is a very self-serving suggestion, since I've been interested in traditional reading practice for most of my career as a sinologist. Why reading aloud? It isn't philology all by itself. It doesn't help us deal with access to libraries, access specifically to corrected texts and critical editions, access to new research, exchange of ideas with other philologists, or the training of new hands. I'm not sure reading alone or even reading aloud in a small group is enough. There are other things that a well-run academic environment fosters. For instance, as Bertrand Russell said, a school is like the world. Only government can prevent brutal violence. And of course, what we've lost is exactly school government. But reading aloud does at least keep the texts alive and forces us to keep facing problems in them, and that's the core of philology. I mean that reading aloud forces us to think not only about higher order issues such as what a text means as a whole, or even at a middling order, what individual words and phrases mean. Reading aloud forces us to think about philology's most granular elements, words and their sounds, like Dijkstra's bits and microseconds. Reading texts and reading them aloud is not a replacement for the many intellectual fields of higher order that build on philology. But I'd like to remind you that activity in those fields is often conducted in modern languages already, and one modern language can often supplant another without fuss. In contrast, the original texts and their language cannot have something else swapped in for them. In another decade or two, we may have competent modern Mandarin and English colloquial versions of most of the important classical texts. But if most of our research in and contact with the texts is then done using those versions, we will have failed to preserve philology. Part 5. A case parallel to our own. Let me now digress to describe for you a different model for the loss of American sinology programs, the loss of the attention to sinology in modern Taiwan. The modern term here in Chinese for this field is 国学, national studies, or the study of national civilization. In this sense, in Chinese, it seems to be a recent term and imbued with ethnic nationalism. Let me add that in high antiquity, 国学was the name of a school where little boys learned to dance. Dancing of the kind they were talking about was a matter of state ritual in those times. In the Middle Period, 国学was also a school, the national university or imperial college, or state academy, if you will. For the past 20 or 30 years, Taiwan has made strenuous efforts to internationalize, adopting norms comparable to those in foreign countries, in many areas, including not only government and medicine and the arts and so on, but most especially education. As part of that movement, there is much more emphasis than there was 3 decades ago on foreign language and on the local history of Taiwan, and comparably less on classical language and the history of China in the eons before Taiwan was first settled by Han Chinese people about 400 or 500 years ago. The result is that a subset of the people living here in Taiwan, if you ask them about classical Chinese language and literature, express regret about the disappearance of those things from general awareness and especially from the school curriculum. That's not the only point of view, of course. Other people will tell you that classical Chinese language and literature and the ideas that come along with them are a moral straitjacket or a political Trojan horse for forces they oppose. But there is even so a widely shared sense that something important is being lost or has already been lost. I think of this sense of loss in society as a model for how philologists of Chinese may think about the loss of our academic home. I'm also keen on the metaphor of loss of physical documents. I mean things like the burning of libraries, so vivid in our imaginations. We have prefabricated images of these things in our minds. The burning of the library at Alexandria, and the Qin dynasty's burning of the books, and of course burial alive of scholars, for they're always mentioned together. I've read that the library at Alexandria wasn't actually immolated, but disintegrated gradually. And I don't know if the Qin atrocities actually happened or not. Remembering Dijkstra's model, I'm limiting myself to the fine detail scope, the phrase, burn the books and bury the scholars alive, rather than higher-level scopes that include facts and what we're supposed to think about them. For me, the phrase is real and vivid. But there are other models of the destruction of literate scholarly records. We have a first-hand account, for instance, of a couple in the 12th century who collected rare documents and ancient inscribed vessels, and who eventually lost everything during a period of political turmoil. Everything except for the catalog of the pieces. The catalog, or something purporting to be the catalog, survives. Like the loss of the Alexandrian Library, that's a somewhat better parallel to the destruction of American philology programs through neglect. Better still, maybe, is the example of Xiao Yi, the prime emperor, such was his title, of the Liang era, Liang Yuandi, who reigned 552 to 555. When his capital fell to rebels in 553, he had a secretary burn some 140,000 books and illustrations. He also tried to throw himself into the flames, but was prevented by palace women and his own attendants. Some weeks later, someone asked, "What was your intention in burning the books?" "Even after reading 10,000 volumes, I have arrived at the ruination of the present day, even so. That is why I burned them." In brief, he was disillusioned over the advice the ancients gave him about government and about not getting overthrown. I would like to digress a little further and talk to you about Taiwan's use of scholarship from the People's Republic of China. When the People's Republic was founded in 1949, the nationalist government of what was called the Republic of China reconstituted itself in Taiwan. The Republic, therefore, became associated with the government in Taipei, and the Republican era was thought of as being half in the Chinese mainland up to 1949 and half on Taiwan after 1949. Into the mid-1980s, an enormous amount of scholarship was available to buy in Taiwan bookstores. Recently, I've been using some of those books. Publication information for a typical volume is as follows. This is a typical case, published 1983 in Taipei. The line that has the arrow pointing at it says, "Collated and annotated by Wang Zhongwen of the Republican era." But Wang Zhongwen, who lived from 1901 to 1969, was accused of espionage and died by poison in the People's Republic. He was never in Taiwan, though much of his family was. His work was reissued here under the name Wang Cicong. And this book, the one I have in my hand, appeared in Beijing in 1979. In other words, first of all, Wang Zhongwen's work appeared under a false name, Wang Cicong, in Taiwan, and it can still be found under that name in libraries here. Second, he committed suicide in political disgrace in the People's Republic in the fourth year of the Cultural Revolution, 1969. Third, he was rehabilitated in the People's Republic, and his magnum opus, this book, completed 1964, was published in Beijing in 1979. Finally, the same book was then published in Taiwan in 1983 under his true name, but he's listed in the publication information as a person of the Republic of China, giving no evidence of his life in the People's Republic. I saw many books of this kind for sale in small bookstalls in Taiwan as late as 2001. During the mid-1980s, when Taiwan was still under martial law, they were widespread and available even in regular bookstores. Sometimes they appeared under a false authorial name. At other times, instead of a byline, the cover and title page would say 本社编, which means edited by our publishing house. It was a joke in those days that this scholar surnamed Ben, given name 社编, was a highly prolific author. I believe access to scholarship is essential, and I don't criticize the practice of reissuing the work of scholars who stayed in the People's Republic during that era in Taiwan's history, especially in the cases of scholars who were persecuted or work that was suppressed because of political motives. I believe reissuance here was for the long-term good health of Chinese philology. But the impression one had then, and has now if one looks back at publications from that time, was that Taiwan was a hotbed of scholarly production. In fact, a large chunk of the scholarship in print then, and no, I don't have numbers for you, a large chunk of the scholarship was the work of people who never came to Taiwan from the People's Republic at all. You might also have had the impression that there was comparatively little scholarship being done in the People's Republic. That was not the case. Much major scholarship was done in the 1950s and up to the first half of 1966, when the Great Revolution of Proletarian Culture, or Cultural Revolution, began. Much more was done after stable government was reestablished in 1978. And even during the second half of the Cultural Revolution itself, the Zhonghua Shuju was quietly publishing a carefully edited, complete paperback edition of the dynastic histories based on the older Bonaban, the collation of best editions from the 1930s. And if you look at this table, you can see from 1959 to 1977 which volumes were issued in this series in which year. From 1966 to 1970, nothing was published. Those were the worst initial 5 years of the Cultural Revolution. Serious work seems to have begun again in 1971, but there is this empty period. And the nationalist government here always portrayed itself, in contrast to the communists, as the defenders of traditional Chinese civilization, including scholarship. So the impression you got from the way books were attributed was indeed that Taiwan was a hotbed of scholarly production. But it was not quite so, not anyway exactly the way it seemed. And I would like to digress just a bit further and talk about access to texts here in Taiwan, classical Chinese texts. There have long been efforts in China to make texts more widely available to people, often with helpful glosses and sometimes with paraphrases into more accessible language. The 8th century Wuchen Zhu Wenxuan is an effort of that kind to make broadly intelligible one of the most important anthologies of its time and since. And I've seen books from the mid-1920s with glosses and full translation of the classical text into Mandarin, such as the Zuozhuan Pingzhu Duban from Shanghai in 1925, carefully marked Yanwen Duizhao, classical Mandarin parallel text. Now this is too small to see, but see the proportions. Classical text first, then commentary and notes, and finally vernacular translation. In 1951, the Mandarin Daily News, that's 国语日报, began publishing a weekend supplement that contained contemporary literature but also extracts from classical literature. For the latter, there were notes and a Mandarin translation as well. This came every weekend to every newspaper subscriber. The classical contents were all standard anthology pieces. The great interest of this publication was that each character was marked with its pronunciation in Mandarin, using the Mandarin phonetic symbols. The text was even intended to be broadcast by radio in Taiwan itself. In recent decades, the Mandarin Daily News has been thought of as a newspaper for school children, but in those days much of Taiwan's adult population either spoke Japanese rather than Mandarin, or spoke Mandarin with a heavy, non-standard regional accent. This publication was meant in part, therefore, to help promote Mandarin in Taiwan. However, because every single character was marked with its pronunciation, the texts gave a great deal of information to readers about standard pronunciation. For classical texts, in which special readings are sometimes different from vernacular usage, this 70-year-old publication is still an important record of reading practice. As an example, this is the top half of issue 10, page 1, November 19th, 1951. The content is the biography of Yue Fei, a prominent 12th century patriot, taken from a history published in 1346. In 1966, not by chance, the very month of the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, the Sanmin Book Company began publishing a series of readers, duban, of classical texts. These readers were like the Mandarin Daily News materials. They contained a carefully edited version, usually, of the text, notes, a Mandarin translation, and Mandarin annotation of each character. But in addition, each volume contained a whole book, not excerpts. Many volumes were collaborations among 2 or more scholars, and in addition, many also had an additional scholar serving to 校阅, collate and carefully review the finished text. The first text in this series was the 四书, 4 books, the primary traditional Confucian text for the young. The second was the 古文观止, a 17th century anthology of classical prose much used in education of the young since its publication. The third and fourth were the highly readable ancient thinkers 荀子 and 庄子, then 2 popular anthologies of poetry, and so on. There are now 217 titles, some of them important historical works of many volumes, some religious texts, some important documents of historical law codes, and much of the most important literature. Publication was still ongoing as of last year. Here's a sample page from the 大学 and the cover of the first of the readers in Confucian blue. This series is not in good odor among many philologists, either domestically or overseas. My own sinology teachers all urged their students to avoid using these books, except for Jerry Norman, who said he thought it didn't matter much and anyway everybody used them. The issue is that these readers are not satisfactory tools for full-fledged scholarly research on the texts they contain. The editions of the texts themselves are derivative, no matter how carefully they've been collated. The notes are rarely definitive, and the Mandarin translations are sometimes debatable. However, Sanmin's series was imitated by the powerful Taiwan commercial press, without character-by-character readings, in 1969, and since the 1990s, other publishers have tried such projects. The appeal is clearly that these books represent middle ground between full-fledged scholarly critical editions on one hand, and on the other, popular, vernacular-only translations that often seem to have been produced carelessly. By the way, since the 1980s, Sanmin began turning to scholars in the People's Republic to produce many of these volumes. Their names did appear on the books, but not until around 2011 did their non-Taiwan credentials begin being listed as well. Part 6. The Future. Earlier I mentioned the burning of an imperial library by a disillusioned emperor during the 6th century. A 17th century scholar, Wang Fuzhi, also commented that the emperor did not bring destruction on himself because he read, but then again it wasn't necessarily not because he read either. Wang says that, in his own writing, the emperor paid too much attention to fine detail in his choice of words and citation of fact. That shows he was too intent on showing off his knowledge, and when he was reading, he surely ignored the messages in the texts about what constitutes sound government. That is why he lost his empire, and not that he read too much and got poor advice from the sages. Wang would no doubt think the same thing about my interest in keeping philology alive. It's not necessary, he would say, except in relation to the higher scope import of the texts. That is a widely voiced opinion in Chinese civilization. The native word for fine-grained philological study is actually 小学, studies appropriate to children at the beginning of their learning. The same word means something like minor, trivial learning. In this talk, I've avoided the dichotomy that my colleague at the plenary, Ahmed El-Shamsi, has made in referring to indigenous as against Orientalist philology. But although there is plenty of respect for Chinese philology practiced by people not of this civilization, in recent times, nationalism and philology are closely related matters. Even I, though merely a philologist, have written a little about that subject. It's listed in the bibliography. And it is possible, again, I'm a philologist, not a cultural historian, but it seems possible to me that for much of history, being part of Chinese civilization meant being linguistically part of the civilization. If that's the case, it may be that the only real way to keep Chinese philology alive is to do so while living in Chinese civilization itself. Thank you for your time. There's a 2-slide bibliography, and this is the end.